Hello and welcome back to Sustainable AF. In this first series, we're taking you on a guided tour of the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs, a framework designed to help build a more sustainable future.
I'm Felicia. I'm a specialist in the transition to a low-carbon future.
And I'm Alex. I'm a former bond trader and I'm now building a regenerative agriculture startup. Today, we're going to be looking at SDG 9. That's industry, infrastructure, and innovation. And we're going to break it down and look at each one. Why does it matter? What does it cost? And who pays for it?
Now, when we first started looking at this SDG, we thought it was so all-encompassing that we'd need to do at least 3 sessions just to cover it. But the important point is that each of these elements, industry, infrastructure, and innovation, are interconnected. And these interlinkages mean it's a great way to, if we change these, to move towards a greener future. It's in showing how this works that we're going to move forward. And at its heart, it all comes down to how we expect to grow our societies, how we expect them to function, and how we pay for it.
Now, I like to think of these 3 in a really simple metaphor of building a house. Infrastructure is our foundations of the house. Industry are the walls, and innovation are the solar panels on the roof.
You only actually have to look at what constitutes infrastructure to understand this. It's so much more than just buildings and roads and trains and energy systems. It means health infrastructure. It's about education infrastructure. Yes, it's real world assets, but it's also the systems and the processes that improve our quality of life.
Industry and industrial growth have always been about jobs and GDP as a marker of economic success. However, we are now entering a new phase of economic operation where we need to build things differently, where we measure growth in more than simply money and GDP. Overall, we really mean that we need to find a new way of defining growth and sustainable economic operation while staying within the finite planetary boundaries and environmental limits. The thing is, it used to be that industry was focused on manufacturing, but as our technologies and approaches change, so too does our definition of industrialization, especially in the area of digitalization and the transformation of Industry 4.0.
So all these changes have meant we have to find new economic models that work with this new thinking. As Dimitris Zangelis has said, if we focus on how efficiency and productivity improvements, this shows us how we can decouple GDP, which is gross domestic product, from things like materials use and resource use and pollution and emissions. This is where we start, but where we need to end up is a completely new way of looking at consumption and materials.
That means we need to start redefining the underpinnings of how we track infrastructure, industry, and innovation, and move away from the frankly blunt instrument that is gross domestic product. Only by looking beyond GDP as a single metric of capital growth can we begin to consider more than just economic growth and begin to consider different types of capital. For example, natural capital, human capital, social capital, and manufacturing capital. Now, there are a few different definitions of the different types of capital. There's the 5, 6, 7, and there's even an 8. But we're going to focus on just the 5s today, and we're going to put a diagram in to show you what that looks like.
Yeah, so you can always check that out on the website. Now, this is all about really the conversation about growth, and we're not going to talk in enormous amounts of detail about the different models and ideas about degrowth here. We'll talk about this in another pod. But the reality is we still want to see growth in some way because we understand it as having such clear links with the things that we value under the SDGs. Things like lower child mortality, declines in preventable diseases, educational and scientific growth and learning, equal opportunities, the rule of law, and one of the obvious ones, financial security.
And that brings us right back to one of the ideas we've talked about, the greening of the economy, which looks at these 3 through a lens of environmental concern and value. The first step is to align our image of growth to green requirements. the idea that addressing climate change and preserving natural capital must be higher priorities for long-term survival and sustainable growth.
And of course, innovation lies at the heart of the green economy, as well as the changing nature of industrialization. And as we've said, that means new technologies, new processes, new business models, new policies, and new economic frameworks. But in order to do this right, we have to talk about both the benefits and the drawbacks.
There is no doubt that innovation can be a life changer and a game saver. The internet fundamentally changed the way the world did business. While the development of effective vaccines against COVID in less than a year would have been unfathomable a decade ago, what matters is harnessing innovation in a positive way and using it to help preserve life and value.
Yes, so we've talked in the past about the scientists who came up with amazing solutions to problems that ended up being disastrous. So what we need is some kind of guiding principle. And one of the approaches that's been really popular has been using this idea of people, planet, profit. So this was an idea that John Elkington came up with 25, 30 years ago, now replaced with this idea of the importance of green swans. So again, we'll put some stuff on the website for you to look at if you're interested. But all it is saying what we need to think about is not the specifics of accounting, but about trajectories and movements towards where we want to be.
So talking about trajectories, this podcast is Sustainable AF, and we are looking at the Sustainable Development Goals. But we keep hearing this word regenerative, so we had a look into it. Regenerative capitalism is about respecting and replenishing the systems that underpin our world. As Elkington said about it, how do we build resilience into our companies, our supply chains, economies, societies, and communities, as well as the biosphere? In the end, the only way we do it is through regeneration. So we're going to touch on regeneration as we go through the pods, because we like the concept. Well,
it's very much this process of how you get to where you want to be. And Alex and I talk about this all the time, this idea that the SDGs is a framework that allows us to have the necessary conversations. But so one of the ways to think about it is, you're starting off with sustainability, you're having the conversations, you're trying to understand what goes on, you're moving towards the circular economy where you're thinking about retaining everything and making the most out of what we've got. And in the end, you end up with regenerative. So we're going to now dive into the details of how these things can be approached for industry, infrastructure, and innovation.
So let's start off with infrastructure. Coming back to my metaphor, this is the foundations of the house.
Infrastructure matters because it can have multiple benefits over time. Countries invest in it because it acts as an economic multiplier. It drives positive economic performance, and that can be in terms of jobs, in terms of connections between geographies and districts. It enables supply chains, and overall, it basically supports society. And the impact doesn't last for just a couple of years. It can last for decades after a particular project is completed.
Now, the challenge, as ever, is, of course, money. Where does it come from? How is it managed? Infrastructure has a long history of stories of waste and mismanagement, from the development of power plants to meet demand that never actually arise, or completely unnecessary developments. Italy was famous for a while for large infrastructure investments in the south of the country that didn't properly connect to anything at all. We need planning, forethought, and understanding of what we're trying to achieve for the longer run. Remember, it was government money that funded the early days of the internet. It was public money that enabled renewable energies to develop and deploy in the face of fossil fuels. But it's private money that takes it to really widespread scale.
So where money comes from, both institutionally and in terms of its end goals, matters. We know that the money needed for the low carbon transition exists, whether that's on corporate balance sheets or in sovereign and hedge funds, or in accounting things in weird places. The question is, will that money be deployed, and what is going to drive it to deployment? Are there projects at a scale to interest financiers that only invest at 500 million or above? Are there policies in place to protect people, to support particular kinds of investment, to particular types of research? What sort of return are people looking for?
Should it be the government that fund it through taxes for the good of society? Or should it come from a source like pension funds because it's for the future? How should this payment scheme work? It's about encouraging funds to spend it in ways that benefit society in both the short and long term. But in order to get there, we need longer term horizons and new frameworks for assessing value and return.
A great recent example of this is the work of the Dasgupta report on biodiversity, as well as the SEEAEA. That's actually a framework that allows for natural capital accounting. What that does, if we can create natural capital accounting as an understanding of the value of nature, that can be used to fund the creation of new green infrastructure, green energy, and green innovation. There are new ideas being explored, like debt for nature swaps, which are a mechanism for cancelling a proportion of a developing nation's foreign debt in exchange for local investment in environmental protection.
Basically, such countries can put money into protecting their natural assets rather than paying interest on debt that has been accumulating for decades. Of course, there has to be a question of whether that might result in foreign ownership of those assets. And like any of these new policies or schemes, it has to be thought through in the long term.
So policy, investment, civic society demand, and governance structures all need to be considered to create these new industries in the way that we want them. Careful planning needs to go into the roadmap of how we're going to get there. The reality is that demands a great deal of education, it demands discussion, and it means we have to create new mindsets and new sets of skills. We can't forget the need for behavioral change and, as we've said, a reconceptualization of what we want our world to look like. The SDGs give us a floor from which we can argue and learn.
Yeah, so just honing back in on SDG 9, it's about building resilient infrastructure, the promotion of inclusive and sustainable industrialization, and to foster green innovation. It was designed because of the fall in manufacturing, a recognition of the need for industrialization to provide access to the poor, and that's talking about small-scale industries, increased investment in R&D, access to the internet, to credit, and the adornments of modern living, as well as an overall recognition of the need to build resilience in the fact and the face of climate change.
So building on the idea of regenerative capitalism, we need to hold on to this word resilience. It's a key word to hold on to throughout all of our discussions, because we need to factor in a lot of changing environments in the not so distant future. So building, developing, and longer term thinking is more important than ever when thinking about more sustainable infrastructure. One of the things we also need to understand is that we're learning as we're doing. The SDGs were published in 2015. They were built on the Millennium Development Goals. We are learning more about how things work. We're developing a new language for how we think about things. What's the point in building a seawall 2 meters high to combat a rising sea level change because 100-year-old historic data tells you that's okay? But in the last 10 years, we've seen 10 of these 100-year storms. So building that seawall 2 meters higher isn't really going to help at all. Actually making that wall 8 meters taller is going to work out cheaper in the long run.
Economists like infrastructure investment because it creates jobs and revitalizes communities, while politicians seem to like that it does that, whilst also providing something concrete that they can point to and say, hey, I did that.
A great example of infrastructure investment in a new way is looking at what's happening in the US. There's no doubt that infrastructure there, like in many other countries, either due to a lack of funds or a lack of focus, is in dire straits. Despite its wealth, infrastructure investment has lagged in the last few decades, especially in terms of transport. And what that really means across the board is a lack of investment in public goods.
Bridges are crumbling, mass transport is uneven or sometimes not even existent, and electrical transmission and distribution networks are being tested and are coming up short. We saw this very recently in Texas. The cost is also escalating, so the federal government doesn't invest in mending roads, and it cost the US $15 billion in 5 years just to fix potholes, as well as lack of digital infrastructure has damaged education through the pandemic. Pollution controls are weak, and you just have to look at what's happened to the water supply in Flint, Michigan, to see the results of what poor infrastructure causes.
So in early April 2021, Biden announced a plan for $2 trillion in infrastructure investment, in large part to be funded by a corporate tax increase. Now, this is obviously where it gets interesting because we talk about who pays and how, because this is going to lead to a massive argument at the heart of US politics. But it's also a debate about how we exist, what we value, what we mean by societal responsibility. And it's an argument that's both political and philosophy, and actually, in my mind, talks to the heart of what we mean by society.
Opponents suggest that the plan will see nothing more than massive borrowing, increased taxation rates, and economic disaster. Yet, the massive tax cuts under Trump really benefited the rich and corporations rather than the average Joes or Joannas. So the real question when we look at change to policy is who's actually going to benefit from infrastructure investment.
And I think the thing to remember, this is a problem everywhere. The World Economic Forum, pre-COVID, was predicting a $15 trillion infrastructure gap by 2040. The question is, we need infrastructure investment to create jobs and drive growth, but how do we do this in a way that makes sense? Now, if we take this biodiversity approach, look at the Dasgupta review, if you factor in natural capital to the global balance sheet, there's about $145 trillion in unaccounted for natural assets. These obviously represent externalities that aren't yet included in economic frameworks. But that means that the way we're doing things is causing damage without that being taken into account. To protect the value of such natural capital or account for this externality that they represent, there could be regulations or levies or taxes that could rebalance the profit mechanism for any activity driving positive regenerative growth.
It's a wonderful solution. And the nice thing is, it's becoming a reality as these frameworks are built for finance companies, governments, and policymakers to build this accounting around. If we do that, it could affect both the type of infrastructure and the way it's developed. Is it just going to be investing in more concrete roads, flyovers, and building more spaces for private cars? Or is it going to be done in a more holistic and natural asset friendly way than it has been done in the past? Is it going to be green or more generally regenerative? There are clear connections between infrastructure and social outcomes. We know that a lack of healthcare infrastructure had a direct connection to the COVID death rate.
And one of the things we do acknowledge is that language can be really confusing, because green infrastructure isn't just about a general support of clean and green approaches, whether that's green spaces, clean and breathable buildings, rainwater harvesting, materials reuse, even renewable energy. It's also a really specific term describing rivers and streams and canals and other water bodies, all those things that surround us in nature. And what's confusing also is that this is sometimes called blue infrastructure, so it's not always the most helpful. The point I'm making is that when you hear a term, when you read a term, you have to ask yourself what the speaker or writer is thinking about and what it is that they mean.
In contrast to the most grey or man-made constructed infrastructure approaches that have only one goal, completion of the asset, the idea of green infrastructure is to take a more multifunctional approach. That means the same area of land could perform several functions or offer many different benefits. If it's an ecosystem, it's about enhancing nature's ability to deliver multiple ecosystem goods and services, potentially providing a wide range of environmental, social, climate change, adaptation and mitigation, and biodiversity benefits. It's coming back to looking at the system as a whole.
So basically, this whole discussion is about how can we continue to grow and develop, doing what we do, but renewing the systems around us rather than just fucking it all up as we go.
Beautiful. Now, let's look at industry. And if infrastructure is the foundations of the house, industry are the walls.
In the same way as with infrastructure, it's incredibly important that industrial development is managed in the right way. The situation we're in today is a direct consequence of the Industrial Revolution, the discovery of coal power and the steam engine. The use of coal transformed the world. It did bring many people out of poverty, but it also resulted in wars and enslavement, and over a couple of hundred years, basically helped drive the destruction of the environment.
Today, we're looking at the fourth industrial revolution. That's digitalisation. And while it brings many benefits, it would be foolish to ignore the fact that many jobs can be automated or replaced. So what do we do with the people that can potentially be left behind? I always think it's interesting to think about China's development. Huge amounts of innovation and invention over centuries, but they never really bothered to industrialize. And that was because they had so many people, it was basically cheaper to use people power. No one needed an industrial revolution if you take that principle.
And actually, it's really interesting because you could argue that one of the drivers of the Industrial Revolution was the plague. Killed so many in Europe that actually you had to find another way of powering economic activity. But that's a whole thing. And actually, I'd recommend you all read Guns and Germs and Steel. It's a brilliant book. It's quite old, but it explains how everything grew. It's amazing. Anyway, the point we're trying to make, so we know that industry drives economic growth. It drives job opportunities as new companies grow. That means it reduces income poverty. That in itself has an impact on education, on growth, on poverty overall. But we have to accept that industrial development can cause problems. Automation can lead to job losses. What happens when the only jobs available are sort of by rote and don't get protected? There are big industrial failures because the system doesn't work. You just have to look at Seaspiracy or any of the documentaries about what's gone wrong in globalized industry to work out that, again, we need to think about industry in a different way.
You dropped the Seaspiracy bomb there, Fee. That has been having
one of Alex's favourite.
Lots of attention recently, and we will definitely be mentioning that when we come to the SDG on the oceans. But back to industry. And we're back to the word resilience. As it comes up with infrastructure, it really matters here. It's not just about the externalities that we see in financing infrastructure, but today the world is connected through a global supply chain and distribution model. Things are manufactured in China and sold on the other side of the world. It's a just-in-time model. It's cost-effective, but as we saw through COVID, which was a shock to the system, it completely fell over and stopped working.
So that means that we might actually need to develop a smaller, more local manufacturing base if we're going to look at industrial growth. That means a shorter, more responsible supply chain, or at least we hope it does. This is going to be especially important in developing markets, where local small-scale manufacturing and supply chains can lead local work and growth, and they need a lot less capital to get started. It's also really important because small-scale manufacturing is often responsible for family employment, for local employment, village employment. That's before we even touch on new technologies, which we'll talk about in innovation. But there are amazing developments that are actually happening at the most local level. So it's not just small-scale manufacturing using traditional tools or simple automation, but it's taking advantage of new technologies like 3D printing, or looking at the impact of modular construction and all these different new ways of looking at how we build an industrial model.
There is a huge financial opportunity here. And while financial costs may be low due to a globalized supply chain, it would be interesting to do a comparison of the financial, social, and environmental costs of the global supply chain versus the local supply chain.
Yes, so this is the big picture. What do we do with industrial systems that have no resilience? What do we do with industries like fishing that are in such a bad state in parts of the world that they're on the brink of collapse? There's $35 billion in subsidies paid to fishermen globally. Well, why not pay them to protect or restore marine ecosystems? instead of just fishing? Why not carbon farm marine grasses and use the carbon sequestration payments to pay fishermen? I mean, obviously, this needs a price of carbon to actually be realized and to work, but it's an idea that could prove a solution for a really complex and dire situation.
You just touched on a really interesting point there, Fee, and that is a price on carbon. There is a price on carbon at the moment, but it's far too low. It doesn't reflect any of these externalities. We are getting closer and closer globally to a global price on carbon, and I think that will unlock so many benefits when looking at natural capital accounting and how we can switch industries to a more regenerative or sustainable pathway. Now, there are, of course, what we call the hard to abate sectors, and that really means they use a lot of carbon, and we need a lot of what they make in today's economic models. And that's talking about things like plastic, concrete, steel, which aren't going to go away anytime soon unless there's big innovation. They're all key industries for development and growth of countries, and therefore their economies, yet they all have terrible, terrible environmental externalities through their production and their waste. So that is quite literally the $1 trillion question that the SDGs are trying to make us think through and change. How do we develop still using these climate environmentally friendly ways? Is there a way, or do we need to completely change the development model? And this is where innovation comes in. Green concrete, what are the positives and negatives? Moving away from plastic use. Locally
How we clear up plastic.
Yeah, locally produced steel.
Or actually, there's some amazing stuff. There's some kind of new, well, relatively new process where the byproducts of, so the carbon dioxide in steel is being used to create some kind of new fuel. But anyway, it's all amazing stuff. We'll link to stuff on the website. I think what we're really talking about is there are these incredible innovative opportunities, but we have to understand what's going to drive interest in them. So I know we've talked about the different types of capital, and we're focusing a lot on the importance of natural capital. But actually, if we include accounting for natural capital into industrial processes, it actually allows for a key change in those processes, like reforestation while logging, like being concerned about water conservation when manufacturing clothes, like ocean clear up while fishing, although that's a little bit of a delicate.
Ouch.
We're going to talk about this. Alex and I have been going back and forth on this for about a week, which is why we keep touching on it. But there are other elements here. So one of the things that I think is really exciting is the Green Wall in Africa. It's restoring deserts to grassland while actually raising livestock. All of this is about economic activity in a regenerative setting. So it's all about creating positive feedback loops. And although we need proper standards and metrics to ensure that it's not just greenwash and companies saying what they think, there is a real potential for fundamental change if we get this right.
So to get that right, we definitely need to take a quick look at value chains and supply chains, and then we're going to finish with innovation. Embedding sustainable processes at every level into industrial processes are key to achieving SDG 9. In fact, you could say it's key to achieving all of the SDGs. But this will take a major shift in companies' value chains and supply chains by reassessing them in light of governance, socioeconomic concerns, and the environment. Basically, to think about consequences beyond input costs and financial margins.
And that means we need to think about a green premium. And again, this is one of those terms where you have to be really careful with the language. So today, a green premium is often the term used to describe the cost associated with choosing a technology or a process which is more environmentally conscious. At the same time, the term green premium is actually being used to refer to some investments which cost more because they perform better. So you're paying that premium for a better performance, as well as the idea of paying the premium because it's greener. So you need to understand what's under discussion. We need to think about the entire life cycle, the full ecosystem chain of investment itself.
Yeah, A green premium could allow for all capitals to be accounted for. So a balance of increased profits and losses should cause, in our view, short-term pain, but in the long term, a good gain. Industries that do not adhere to new market shifts will be left behind. And on that point, will it really be economical to ship a mango from Africa to China for packaging and then back to the US for sale when carbon taxes are a reality? Or will a new way of farming mangoes in the US be demanded from consumers and government?
And it's all about actually your own power. Because, if we as individuals, if we as members of companies or whatever it is, if we demand action, it may well happen. Now, I'm going to borrow Alex's analogy here, and we're going to go on to innovation. And to use the house analogy, if we're talking about industry as the walls of the house, the things that keep it all supported, well, then innovation is the solar panels on the roof.
I'm a massive fan of innovation as it drives us forward. Whether you're Elon Musk rocketing, the rocketing industry and EV markets forward, Mark Carney driving the TCFD forward in finance, or scientists that are creating bricks out of fungus that are even stronger than concrete. Innovation is epic.
And actually, I'm just going to jump in because you mentioned Mark Carney driving the TCFD forward. Basically, that's an acronym for the Task Force on Climate Risk-Related Disclosure. See, I can't even do it. It's acronyms. The point is, it's about trying to integrate climate risk into finance. And that's what innovation is about. It's about taking risks. It's about trying new things. And one of the things we have to accept, unfortunately, is that mistakes are going to be made along the way. What matters is that we innovate in a trajectory that rewards regenerative thinkers. Every sector, every expert, everyone thinks that what they do, the solution they have, that is the solution to a problem. Every established sector thinks that what they do is the way things should be done. They can't even begin to comprehend that things could be done differently. We need to develop a mindset that says it's okay to try. Because in the end, both success and failure teach us things worth knowing. We can unlock a lot of the solutions that we need with human potential. Human potential to solve so many of the current infrastructure and industry challenges we face. None of these are going to be the silver bullet, but there is no doubt that some are going to be game-changing. Just look at renewable energy.
Absolutely. On a really positive note, when you look around the world and all different industries, the innovation that's going on into them towards a net zero pathway, greening of the economy, hard to abate sectors is absolutely amazing. Innovation also matters because it allows us to be smarter about how we manage resources and getting more out of them. Investing in science, creativity, and innovation can accelerate our ability to use fewer resources. That's what we've seen in the energy sector with renewable energy, batteries, smart grids, and the automotive sector with EVs, as well as a big one, the heating sector, with a drive towards decarbonisation. But innovation doesn't just happen from our R&D. It needs skills, education, supportive market frameworks, and investable projects, as well as, of course, favourable policy and investment fears, encouraging innovators to push their ideas further and wider.
At this point about a favourable policy and investment sphere is so fundamental. Innovation is about more than science and technology. It's about processes and it's about policy and it's about behavioural change. In the end, done right, it's about a mindset. It's about a worldview. It's about what you believe is a reasonable response. Remember that some of the biggest innovations have had unexpected consequences and that frameworks and usability, it needs to be in place for change to take place, if that's not a tautology. But change won't happen if the innovation isn't right. Just look at mobile phones. I mean, look at the development of telephony. I think at one point there was a mayor in the States that said one day every city in America will have a telephone. And now, people have got 2, 3. It's all about having things on them that people want to use.
Yeah, if you can dream it, do it is corny as hell. But that's kind of where we are with the green revolution. Like, we can totally get there. We just need some people to get out of the way and allow the betterment of society, humanity, planet to get going, because there's great economic opportunities as well as social opportunities. It's epic. And that leads me on nicely to let's not forget the opportunity that innovation brings for leapfrogging. Let's not forget the opportunity that innovation brings. We've had 100 or 200 years of industrial revolution in the global north, and the global south now doesn't have to go down that pathway. If you take it to an example today of mobile phones, it has shown an industry can be deployed without the need to build out a whole fixed telephone network, which has meant billions of saving in infrastructure and allowed the global south to develop at a much faster rate with, dare I say it, slightly less emissions. It can be a lot more cost effective to invest in new systems rather than simply patching up old systems.
And what's interesting about this is the need for innovation in finance, the need for innovation in the greening economy, and the drive towards a more sustainable development pathway, because our current pathway isn't fit for purpose anymore. So I know I keep harping on about this, but it's about changing the way we do things and see things. It's about the role of capital, whether it's conscious capital or stakeholder capitalism, but it's also about the role of the state and about private companies. What's their role in society? Just because for the last 200 years, industrial capitalism has been the norm, it doesn't mean the future has to be the same. We've got an effective roadmap to start addressing the challenge. And that's the SDGs. It's the different types of capital. It's a pricing in externalities. If we bring all this together in a sort of powerful framework that actually is shared, is standardized, and is measurable, it actually will drive the kind of innovation that we need to see to drive our economies forward with better infrastructure and cleaner industry.
The connection between infrastructure, industry, and innovation plays out on a global scale, but it's also reflected in the patterns of how every new industry is developed and technology is deployed on a local scale. We need to take an overarching view of what's going on if we're going to make sense of it, and we're going to need to do more with less.
So that's how we think you can build the house that is infrastructure, industry, and innovation. SDG 9 is so important to achieving many other goals. And actually, as I say it, I think I say that every single time. That's one of the reasons they're the SDGs. This is about taking a systems-based approach to achieve new models allowing sustainable development to happen.
So we've got 3 takeaways for you to get today, guys, after our waffling podcast.
One of the key ones, and I think this underpins everything we talk about, is that society pays. You know, we talk about who's paying for what, but in the end, whether we're paying in taxes or in social unrest or in environmental destruction, we need to look at new ways of modeling the world and finding innovative solutions, because in the end, we're all paying for what we're doing.
Number 2, we have the skills and knowledge to address these problems, but we need to completely rethink our relationship to each other and the world around us. This isn't something you can solve in isolation. There's no silver bullet, just a lot of clever inventions and uses, and a lot of hard work.
And then thirdly, and I think this is probably going to be key, we need to think about balance and the system as a whole. Should one SDG have priority? In sustainable fishing, for example, there's lots of focus on transforming industry practice and ensuring the removal of slavery. And do not get me wrong, that couldn't be more important. But that's then heavily prioritized over the environmental robustness of its processes. So we have to start finding ways of weighing up which one of the SDGs we want to focus on.
So that brings us to our close. If you're a fan of Sustainable AF, please do spread the word. Tell your friends, give us likes, ratings and reviews, or you'll share your thoughts on our social media. We have no marketing budget, so our reach depends entirely on people like you. And of course, join us next week as we continue on our journey to becoming Sustainable AF. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys. Bye.